In this video, I will be showing you how to take off a heatsink from a graphics card, or also known as a GPU, and applying new thermal paste onto it. The reason for reapplying new thermal paste on your graphics card is over time, when your graphics card gets older and the heat produced by it will start breaking down the existing thermal paste and making it less effective on cooling your die on your GPU. You may notice over time your card running hotter, the fan starting to ramp up faster, louder, and as like this card especially it's kind of old, so over time it's good to apply new thermal paste and you'll see that it'll start performing a lot better. Maybe you're also getting a lot of like stuttering just because of the graphics card being overran or running too hot. It'll definitely affect the performance of it. So to start, you need to figure out which screws are holding the actual plastic shroud for the fan. All cards are going to be different in how their layout is, but when I was inspecting this one, I noticed that the screws to take off the shroud are going to be these ones, this one, and that one. And once we get those off, we're able to actually take the heatsink off, which will be these four screws right here. And as you can see, the sticker on these, they usually have stickers on the screws for the actual, like where it's mounted to the heatsink, the pressure plate. And as you see, it's never been, the stickers have never been broken because there's a Phillips screw underneath there. So this is the original thermal paste of this card, and this card's quite old, so it's definitely overdue. So before I start taking any screws out, it's always a good idea to know exactly where they go. So when you put this all back together, you're using the right screws, because sometimes they could be different sizes or lengths. And the build mat that I'm using kind of has like a GPU outline where you can kind of just like, I'll just put the screws in the general area where they go, but you can also draw something out, or just, like I said, just remember where those screws go, because it can be crucial that they go exactly back in the same spot. So now I take in the screws off that are all connected to the shroud. You can see that this is all loose. The only thing that's holding it right now is the ribbon cables for the RGB and the fans right here. So that's the only thing holding on. So now that we know that we've have the fan shroud separated from the back plate, we know that we can take these out and it should come apart. So it's going to be the same for every graphics card or GPU. As far as the heatsink mounting plate, it's going to always be these four screws, because it keeps pressure on the actual GPU die, which is underneath this, all these soldering points. So we'll just take these out. Before we can take the heatsink off, we will need to disconnect the ribbon cables for the fans, and if you have RGB too, these should just pop out. Just kind of squeeze like that, and then there's another one on this side. Like that. See, it's pretty dirty underneath here. So with this card, you actually have two more bolts that are holding the heatsink block on. It's these two. We'll take these out. Other cards I've dealt with took a lot less screws of taking the heatsink block off. This one requires all the screws to be taken out because they're through the back plate into the block, so I need to take the remaining screws out. With all the screws out, I should be able to take the back plate off. And with this, sometimes they'll get stuck, but this one came off quite easily. Sometimes you'll have to like kind of work its way, squeeze it or twist it to break free the old thermal paste to get it off. And what we're going to be replacing is the thermal paste on the die. As you can tell, this is all dried up and old, which definitely will cause it to not cool properly. And you can see on there, it's all old and crusty. To clean off the old thermal paste off your GPU die and heatsink, you're going to want to use isopropyl alcohol, 91% or higher. And the alcohol completely evaporates, and it's safe to use on electronic components and conductive components. Now that we have the die and the heatsink all cleaned off, we're going to install thermal paste on the die. And what you're going to want to do is just make sure that the die is completely covered with thermal paste. Like that. Not pretty, but it's completely covered, so when we put the heatsink back on, it should make full contact with the heatsink and cool properly. As you can see, I blew all the dust out of the fins of the heatsink. And before I put the heatsink on, you want to make sure that the thermal pads stayed in place to where they're supposed to. And the thermal pads are these gray little pads that are on the heatsink and the board. There's one on the back plate too. Sometimes when you take them off, or take apart the GPU, one of those will come off or kind of lift off. You just want to make sure that they're all in place. And now we're ready to put this all back together. Now we're ready to put the heatsink back on. And all we're going to do is start off with these 4 mounting holes, which will line up on the card itself. You should be able to see where these holes line up. When installing the 4 screws around the die, you're going to want to do a cross pattern similar to like you would do with your lugs on a wheel. And like so, if I'm starting here, I'll go across, then across, then across. And I usually like to start them first on all 4 of the holes, and then go back and snug them down. I'm not going to be over tightening them, just do where you can tell when the screw stops. Next, I'm installing the screws that hold the back plate through the board into the heatsink, and I'm not going to install the ones on the shroud just yet. And last, we have the screws for the fan shroud, but also don't forget the connections to the fans themselves, and if you have RGB or lighting of any sort, there'll be another connector. So just make sure to connect those back together. And that's all it takes to disassemble a GPU and install new thermal paste onto the die. The thermal paste I used was just some extra Arctic silver I had, but you can use any thermal paste that's meant for CPU, GPUs, and you should be able to get those anywhere online, Amazon, or any place that sells PC components like Best Buy, Micro Centers. And this card wasn't running particularly hot, but if there's any improvements, I ran benchmark before and then I'll run one after. If there's any improvements, I'll post on the screen. But hopefully you came across this video because you're graphics card was running hotter than normal, or the fans seemed to be ramping up a lot more or a lot faster than they normally do. And following these steps should be what you need to get you on the right track. Most GPUs are will kind of be similar on disassembling. I mean, there'll be different screw placements, and some of them you don't have to take as many screws out, and there's some you'll have to take more, depending on if it has a back plate and how many screws are in the fan shroud. But hopefully this video will help you figure out what you need to get, or what screws you need to get to. And I hope this video helped you, and thank you for watching, and have a great day.